Welcome back to Beyond the Crime, the podcast that takes you into the minds of criminals with your hosts, Dr. Lars Madsen, Shay Addison, and Dr. Rob Brockman.
Welcome back, everyone, to Beyond the Crime, the Psychological Analysis, a podcast where we dive into forensic issues, cases, and matters with a bit of a forensic schema lens. And welcome back, 2025, to Shay Addison, my colleague and co-presenter here. And of course, we are very lucky to have with us today Nathan Brooks, Dr. Nathan Brooks, who is here with us for the second part of lone actor violence, where we're going to focus on a particular case and we're going to take a bit of a forensic schema lens to that. So welcome, guys.
Thank you, Lars. Nice to be back, everybody.
Yes, thank you, Lars and Shay. It's great to be back on the podcast. I am a forensic psychologist and I'm now located in New Zealand. I've been over here for around 5 years now, and I work in the police, looking at operational psychology matters and assisting with police investigations, and also do consulting work on the side around risk and threat assessment.
Okay, great.
And you've recently, you're about to finish a book, aren't you?
Yes.
Can we talk about that?
The book that continues to haunt me. I'm very close to being done. It's going through copy editing now. So hopefully by the second half of the year, possibly July or August, it'll be done and it'll be ready for people to read.
What's the name of it, Nathan?
Well, it's on the topic we're talking about today. So mass casualty violence, and particularly looking at lone actors and the rise of these individuals that really are self-initiating towards violence. Through a variety of factors, whether it's ideologies or personal grievances, and the sharp rise we've seen in these mass casualty attacks over the past decade.
Okay, great. That sounds fascinating. Good topic.
Yeah. And of course, that's what we're going to be talking about today. And so we're going to dive into the case of Gabriel Wortman, who is it's a Canadian case, and it's quite an exceptional case. It's exceptional for a lot of reasons, I think, because I think people will probably remember it listening now, because it was when was it that it happened? It was a number of years ago now, wasn't it?
2020, is that right?
Was it 2020?
Right as we started to hit the early
2020
early COVID peak.
Early COVID peak, yeah. And this was a character that went on a rampage. Was it a 13-hour rampage in 2020 where he ended up murdering 22 people? And he was disguised as a policeman. He had a police car, he had police uniforms, and they couldn't track him down or catch him over that period of time simply because of how well prepared, I guess, he was, and how he had was in disguise, really, wasn't he? Nathan, so this was quite a significant case in lone actor violence folklore, I guess, or research or incidences. I know that you obviously have done a lot of reading and a lot of research on this case. It'd be really maybe you just need to tell us a little bit about the case and what happened and I guess its significance.
Yeah, look, it was really a perfect storm of factors. So we had an individual that I guess had a really problematic personality type, where probably sitting somewhere on that sort of narcissistic psychopathy spectrum, and hadn't really come to police attention before, but in the background had an array of weapons that they'd been acquiring over the years, a number of various sort of deviant and problematic actions that had always been really below the threshold of coming to police attention, but brewing away in the background of their history. A quite financially well-off individual, and at the same time, he had quite a an interest in police paraphernalia, and he had been redoing a replica Royal Canadian Mounted Police vehicle and had managed to restore that so that it really ultimately reflected a real active police vehicle. And at the time, so we're looking at April 2020, he, like a lot of people around the world, had been impacted by COVID. And this resulted in, he was a denturist and he had to reduce his work. He had to reduce his interactions with people. And that resulted in him spending a lot of time alone, isolated with his spouse at the time. And so we see that there was a lot of changes to his life. And on the 18th of April 2020, he had an argument with his spouse. It was actually I think it was the day of their 19th anniversary. And this ultimately is just a hair trigger. It was really a minor argument in the context of things, but looking at it from the outside, it would seem as though he ultimately just snapped. And from here, this 13-hour rampage of violence commenced.
Mm. So he's a 51-year-old guy and a denturist. What is a denturist? I don't quite know what that is.
That's not a dentist.
No, it isn't, is it?
It's like a hygienist or like they make appliances or something?
Dentures, essentially.
Dentures.
So,
Okay.
fitting false teeth.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah.
Teeth. Right. Okay.
So he was a 51-year-old man that had limited criminal history, and was married and had a stable job, or that was his business. Is that right? And he was in a relationship, a long-term relationship. Did you say 19-year wedding anniversary?
That day was their 19th
Wow. So he'd
anniversary,
been
and
the
they
same
were
long-term partner.
stable long-term partner, and they were considering getting married for their 20th anniversary. And essentially there was a phone call that his partner overheard, and Wortman was having a phone call with a friend, and the individual said, "Oh, don't get married," and that triggered his partner to leave the location where they were, and they were in a large sort of shed that Wortman owned, and on the property was also a house. So she left that and walked away, and then while walking back to the house, she had a change of heart and realised that she was overreacting. But when she returned to the shed, Wortman flew into a rage, and the events followed on from there.
Oh, okay. So the events, maybe it would be, are you on top of like, because there's quite a lot of events that then happened afterwards, in terms of, maybe we can just talk through sort of what then happened over the next 13 hours.
Yeah, definitely. So essentially, Wortman had an argument with his spouse, and she then returned to their residence, and within moments of her returning to the house, Wortman then arrived back at the property and violently dragged her out of bed and made a series of threats and remarks to her. He grabbed a firearm and forcibly walked her back to the shed on the property. And he then put her in the back of the replica police vehicle. And whilst she was in there, he was loading firearms and other items into the car. He was briefly distracted during that time, and she managed to escape out of the vehicle and hide it out in the bush. He continued on and left the
So she
residence.
escaped. So he assaults her, tries to kidnap her and confine her, and then while he's off doing something else, she escapes, and he's in the Canadian police car and drives off.
Yeah, he drives out into the neighbourhood, and which is in Porter Peak, an area in Nova Scotia, and somewhat, I guess, I don't know if bizarre is the right word, but he starts targeting and killing their neighbours in the area. And this goes on from basically 10 p.m. in the evening through to about 10:45 p.m., where he kills multiple people in the local area that that are mainly known to him and his partner.
He's just walking around or driving around the neighborhood,
Driving around,
engaging them, or so like 10 o'clock at night is like people will be in bed, or they'll, it's the end of the day, right? So he's actively seeking them out and engaging them.
so he's arriving at their residences, and once they either open the door or well, some of them opened the door, and he went in and basically executed them. And others, he walked into houses or came across them in driveways or in the street and killed them.
Right. And these were people that were known to him, his neighbors. And at the
Yeah,
same time, he's setting fire to the houses. Is that right as well?
yeah. So a mixture of several elderly couples he kills. There's some adolescent children that he kills as well. Middle-aged people. Kills some pets, and some of the properties as well. He sets on fire.
But he doesn't pursue the wife. He doesn't seek out to pursue her into the woods and try to find her. Is that correct? So she survives?
Well, I think they believe that he went looking for her, but just simply was unable to find her.
Okay.
And she hid within a tree hollow away from him, and eventually, several hours later, as the daylight rose in the morning, she came out.
Okay, right.
And then what happens? He goes on the run, because I remember this case in the news back then where there was this period of time where they can't locate him, they can't find him, and all these people have been killed, and he's on the run, and they can't capture him. What happens then?
So he essentially disappears at about a quarter to 11 in the evening, and he then isn't spotted, or doesn't really resurface to around about 6 a.m. the next morning. And he then visits a residence of some friends, and this is in this different area. He's fled from the Porter Peak area, and then he has travelled to a new area in Wentworth, and he's killed those individuals along with their pet. And he's continued over this area over the coming hours, killing several other people, some that are known to him, some that happen to be people that he simply crosses paths with.
Wow.
And things begin to escalate. And at one stage, he comes across a Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer, and he kills her. And during that incident, another passerby comes to help, and Wortman executes him. He places this individual inside his car, and I believe sets it on fire, and then Wortman takes that individual's car. So there's quite a level of complexity where he's changing vehicles in some ways by putting that individual in his car.
And he's dressed in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police uniform.
Yep.
Yep.
And so some in some ways you could have believed that by setting his car on fire, initially you might have thought that he was actually deceased in the incident, but he takes this other individual's car.
Right.
And he then goes and visits, I think, another elderly person that he's acquainted with. Essentially, from there, he kills further individuals, and ultimately he is spotted by police at a gas station around about 11:30 a.m. and he is shot and killed by police at that time.
Okay. So in total, there was 22 people killed, 13 men, 9 women, 3 injured, plus extensive property damage from, I'm just reading, there's 16 fires in a spree that spread over 100 kilometers. Wow. So
So one of my questions, Nathan, I'm curious, and Lars, about your thoughts about this, just coming from a understanding sort of fairly extreme personality disorder, is if we think that, Nathan, you mentioned at the beginning that he kind of fit that, post event, people are thinking he fits that narcissistic personality disorder psychopathy traits. I mean, they're extreme, right? Sort of personality traits to have. But he's 50 something when this happens. So I'm curious about, how that was contained throughout his life and didn't really come to the attention of authorities or of people,
That's exactly what I was thinking as well, Shay.
prior to 51, because normally this stuff, as we know, is something that typically, men in their 20s, are sort of fairly rampant in terms of their problematic behavior. You would anticipate that police or there'd be problems, but yet he seems to have sustained like a successful business, a long-term relationship, which is pretty interesting given that kind of personality makeup.
What is his
What are your thoughts about that, Nathan?
Yeah, it's really quite fascinating. So
Yeah.
it's not as though he was an individual, though, that was free of incidents. So he had plenty of incidents and highly concerning behaviours, but for a variety of reasons, they just had never made their way through to the police in any meaningful or substantial way. So there was a long history of quite significant domestic violence towards ex-partners, including his current partner at the time. He had been confrontational with patients in his denture clinic. He'd threatened several. He had history of alleged inappropriate sexual behaviour towards staff. He was engaging in multiple different infidelities, use of prostitutes, sex workers. There were allegations that he would spot vulnerable, homeless or welfare dependent women and offer them free denture services in return for sexual favours. He had a history of previously assaulting people, but again, it wasn't at the level that it was reported to police or that's at the significant level. He'd been previously before the denturist board for misconduct. So there's a whole, and that's probably just some of the details.
A lot of it falls within that, what we might in Australia refer to as that civil domain, because where you're kind of having things like a civil hearing at his denture, the denture board. Domestic violence is often civil, like it's a civil sort of adjudicated issue, which doesn't allow necessarily that tracking of all of these different things. People might then start to go, holy cow, there's some serious, this guy's dangerous. In retrospect, obviously, when the seriousness of this necessitates people get all the data, you can clearly see that's pretty, that's a bit of a pathway to destruction, isn't it?
One of the things that was really interesting in looking at the volume of various statements pertaining to him was that many people were very fearful of him. And so that was one of the biggest barriers for this information ever getting to police, was that people were so fearful of retribution and what he would do if they found out, or if he discovered that they'd made a statement against him. So I think that particularly speaks to something like his interpersonal dominance over others.
Yeah. Okay. So his creates a sense of fear and intimidation of people. So it's interesting. Okay.
What's with the fascination with the police, and did he try to join the police at some stage or the armed forces? Was he rejected? That's where my mind goes to, because it sounds like he had all these problematic traits that were just kind of bubbling below the surface here, and occasionally kind of flaring up, but never quite crossing the threshold for, proper intervention. But do you know, did he try to enter the police force and was rejected? Is that a part of the story?
I'm not exactly certain of that. There's been so many hundreds of pages that have been published as a result of the Mass Casualty Commission, and that might be hidden in there somewhere.
Okay.
I mean, alarmingly, he studied psychology at one stage, and he also worked as a mortician in a funeral home prior to becoming a denturist. I don't know whether he had applied to be in the police or whether he had a history of being a security guard. It is interesting, though, certainly, I guess, from what we know around serial killers and some violent offenders, is often that fascination with police and the idea of the dominance and the power that's associated with having that level of status, and it does attract certain types of personalities. And there's no doubt that I think Wortman fits into that. And he purchased, I think it was 4 decommissioned police cars. One of them was the vehicle that he completely restored, even inside and outside. So it does speak to potentially the status or significance that he thought he would gain from
Something
being able to model this. Yeah.
What was his childhood like? Do we know much about his background, his early history?
Very traumatic.
In what way?
So there's, through the Mass Casualty Commission, there was quite an examination that was done of that, and he had arguably a detached mother and quite an abusive father. So his father was reported to have been, I guess, in many ways modelling or displaying some of the traits that Wortman displayed as an adult. So there was talk about, multiple infidelities. He allegedly killed Wortman's pet dog.
Right.
And he was also quite threatening and intimidating towards others. And really, Wortman was described essentially as having a childhood devoid of love.
Right. Okay. All right. And that fits very much, I guess, with the theme of our podcast in terms of when we work in the forensic space with using schema therapy, isn't it? Yeah. So his father was abusive and violent. His mother was absent and ineffectual in terms of protecting him from the father. How did he survive? Like, what do we know about how he sort of coped with that? Did he have problems with drugs and alcohol early on, or juvenile delinquency, or not? I mean, I assume that he would have been able to have to get through school or through some kind of high school and to be able to start these careers and pursue these kinds of qualifications. Is that what happened?
Yeah, it is interesting. It's not entirely clear how he coped with that. There's a lot of reports that he harbored a lot of hostility towards his mother, and he didn't believe that she protected him, particularly didn't protect him from his father. And at times there's accounts that, she would go to the father and actually that would escalate things and make the situation much worse. It seems he developed some unusual interests. There's talk about him building explosives and things like that at a young age, and struggling with social connections and with others. So he's described as being a very odd and unusual individual as he reaches his adolescence, but with some antisocial and destructive tendencies. So there's things, there's reports about him doing odd and unusual things like, urinating in public places and in the dormitory rooms and things like that. When he is at college, becoming very sort of obsessive about people and various things that they're doing. So there seems to be quite a cognitive intensity to him from sort of adolescence and early 20s, and then he marries young, so he actually does have a sort of intimate relationship early on, but that ends, and then obviously he progresses towards, being more aggressive to intimate partners as he grows and ages.
One thing, I don't know, that kind of stands out to me, or just sort of an interesting way of maybe thinking about some of what you mentioned. I'm curious about your opinion on it. Is you mentioned about, he worked as a mortician and obviously like a denturist. I kind of look at that and think it's interpersonal again. It's an interpersonal focus, but it's a real sort of almost like facilitates a very detached objectification of it, and a power element over bodies. So mortician is ultimate power, isn't it? You're a dead person, like you can manipulate whatever you want. A denturist is kind of the same, it's a very sort of manipulating somebody's body, like being in charge or being powerful in terms of the impact over their physical body. I don't know if that's come up in any of the analysis or whatever that was done on him, but it kind of stands out that as difficult as it sounds, he found interpersonal interactions, he's certainly moving towards them, but in very, sort of very, very.
What you're saying, Shay, is that he could almost like you could become a truck driver, right? You could choose an occupation or
like,
a career that just detaches you completely from people. But
it could be a wood chopper or something, like you could just remove that kind of stuff from your life effectively to a large degree if you wanted to. But he's made a lot of choices here to move towards people. But some of the choices he's made seem to be a very sort of detached objectification, which I guess facilitates maybe something like, you can kill people's pets, you can execute people, right? Because you are objectified.
Killing people's pets is like that just feels like an overcompensation, doesn't it? Why do you need to kill the pet as well? Like it just feels like, what's going on there? It just seems like everything needs to be destroyed. Like
because clearly
the animals that they have, their houses that they live in, all of it just needs to be burnt to the ground. It seems like he almost has this completely, utterly sort of, I don't know,
scorched earth.
Scorched earth, yeah.
Policy, because presumably he doesn't have a grievance against the pet, right? Maybe the people, but you've got to think it's a hard stretch to think the pets aggrieved him in some way. But so it's more scorched earth, just annihilation in a way.
Yeah, there's some aspects around that narcissistic rage that has arisen from this somewhat minor incident with his intimate partner that evening, coupled with the fact that he's got these personality traits. He's probably had, in some ways, a proclivity towards violence, or at least an interest in violence. And then when you look at how he has targeted the victims, you do see some really interesting things, as you're pointing out, around some of the displaced anger. So I've been fortunate to have some dealings with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police on this case and to have discussed that with them. And they believe that really his victims fitted into 4 categories. So the first was displaced, or sorry, I should say actually grievance-based targets. So those that Wortman felt he had been wronged by. And one of those was an individual in the neighbourhood that he'd had an affair with. And that was one of the people that she had rejected him. And that was one of the people that he killed. Then there were displaced homicide victims. So those that Wortman killed due to them holding some level or representative level of emotional significance to him. So he killed a lot of elderly couples, and he had harboured, I guess, a lot of angst towards his own parents. And there was some suggestion that the fact that these elderly people were happy and living, largely positive lives, he was quite envious and resentful of that. And then there were reactive targets. So they were really individuals that got in Wortman's way, such as the female Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer that he killed. So those that tried to somewhat intervene or potentially were a threat to what he was doing. And ultimately, lastly, there were the incidental random targets. So there were some victims where Wortman was just driving by and they were out walking and he just turned around, drove up to them and shot them.
Mm. It's a bit of the scorched earth kind of stuff, isn't it? Where it's just like no one's getting off scot-free here. Everyone in his path, is going to be affected.
The other thing that was quite interesting was that there were thoughts that so Lisa was his partner, and there were thoughts that
Lisa Banfield
Lisa
is,
Banfield,
wife.
when he put her in the car, that he was actually intending to drive to the residence of her family and kill them all in front of her. And when he was ultimately killed by police, he was heading in the direction towards where her family lived.
Wow. There's a real sadistic component there as well. Now, there's been a lot of analysis of this case. Obviously, I know you've touched on that. Maybe, Nathan, if you were able to give us a little summary of what's been concluded and what kind of diagnoses. I mean, you mentioned narcissistic personality disorder, psychopathy, perhaps. How have people made sense of what happened here and why it happened? And then maybe after that, we can sort of try to take the schema lens to it and see whether we can make sense of it through schema therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a tricky one because there are so many factors. So one of the things, I guess, when we look at lone act of violence is we look at things that pull the person towards entering into sort of a psychological space where violence becomes an option. Then we look at factors that push them towards acting, and that also has to be coupled with personal factors. So what is it about them and their life history that ultimately comes together to make them move towards violence. Another aspect that I've recently been working on in a paper with Christopher Ebrecht is the idea of unmet psychological needs. And for Wortman, when we think about psychological needs, there was an enormous lack of those for him. So he never really established a sense of belonging. So he never really quite fitted in. He wasn't able to get love in his life because of his really emotionally deprived childhood. So he then prioritized other aspects such as significance and his identity because he was unable to fulfill sort of the emotional and reciprocal needs in his life. So it became very much about him and his status, his significance, his superiority. And what was interesting was that he was an individual that had a lot of risk factors, but when COVID arrived and there was a thwarting or some sort of impediment, I should say, to his way of life, that created a lot of psychological issues for him. So his mental health deteriorated when he wasn't able to work, when he wasn't able to go and have his usual infidelities and freedoms that he typically had in his life. There was some level of paranoia that came around the government targeting him. So we see that he lost a level of control that he had over his life. He lost his autonomy. And also he lost his identity and sense of significance. So there was a multitude of factors that were slowly dialing up for him. And I think that loss of control and also the fact that rage that was triggered by him feeling rejected by his partner. I think ultimately he was always
that was like the pinprick that kind of
Yes. Yeah, and one of the models I think we spoke about, Lars, in the first podcast was this idea of the bathtub model, which I really like, which is this gradual filling up of the bathtub of various factors that can, rise the sort of motivational level, and it just tipped over. His factors in the bathtub were full for Wortman, and it took such a minor thing to tip him over. And of course, the other factor is he had the capability. He was very well capable of being violent because he had firearms and the skills and things to act on that.
So I think it's kind of a little bit of, I mean, I know it's post-event and no one can truly know, but a little bit of end-of-line thinking for him when he's made that decision, because clearly you're not going to get out of that in terms of perpetrating that level of carnage, So it's that at some point desistance is not an option at all. Any protective factor that might have contributed to desistance to violence is just completely removed.
Yeah.
And he's prepared to kind of go to the nth degree, like just keep going until it ends in a blaze of sort of, mayhem, I guess.
Yeah. I as you would describe, I mean, that's absolutely right, Shay. I mean, I wonder, like what you're describing in terms of the emotional needs not being met. I mean, within schema therapy, we would think we would be looking at him and saying, well, I mean, his need for security, safety, stability, nurturance, and acceptance doesn't seem to have been met at all in his childhood. His mother was, from what we're saying, ambivalent, detached, and unhelpful in terms of protecting and nurturing him, while his father was dangerous and scary and perhaps even quite sadistic if he's killing his pet. And it sounds like his perhaps way of kind of, regulating himself in the world is through a process of perhaps avoidance, but also overcompensation. Overcompensation in terms of seeing the world as a dangerous place and then being prepared or having perhaps fantasies of violence, of dominating, of taking control or being in control as a way of trying to regulate the way he experiences the world. And I mean, from what my sense is that what he was saying there before is that he's created this world where perhaps he's 51 years old when he does this. And by the time that he's done it, right, he's already accumulated a massive amount of weapons. He's, developed all these, I guess, status symbols of power and control, police uniforms, police cars. And then when this happens, it's interesting that that what seems to be the rupture for him is an attachment rupture. It's the fear of abandonment. Is that right? Like his wife of 19 years, he overhears his wife of 19 years having a conversation with someone else as they're preparing to remarry on their 20th anniversary together as a way of, I guess, sort of committing to each other and committing to the relationship. He overhears someone telling her not to marry him. Yeah, is that right, Nathan? That's what
it's actually the other way around, which is interesting. So they were never married,
okay.
but they were talking about doing their vows and getting married on the 20th anniversary.
Right, okay,
and it's actually someone that tells Wortman not to do that, and it ups and Lisa is triggered by hearing that and leaves. So in some ways, you would think that she may have had the right to be upset, but he is so offended and agitated by the fact that she walks out on him,
right?
Yeah.
And by the time she returns, he's in a rage.
Yeah, so it's his fear of what her reaction might be. Yeah, and so that okay. So definitely that abandonment attachment rupture seems very relevant, doesn't it? So that sense of and an inability to tolerate vulnerability, to tolerate what he might feel as weakness, and being, at the hands of somebody, at the mercy of somebody else, unable to tolerate that.
What do you, if we were to take a schema lens to this and try to think through kind of the different modes, maybe kind of think through the likely schemas that Gabriel Wortman would have had. What are some of the ones that stand out for you guys in terms of thinking about him as a case? What would you be thinking about if you were to meet this person?
The mistrust and abuse, I think, would, in terms of, a core early maladaptive schema, I think would have to be front and center in terms of how you would understand him, along with that disconnection and rejection, domain of schemas. He's got an abundance of that. He's got the mistrust and abuse, abandonment, emotional deprivation, social isolation. He's got all, ticks every box there.
And he would have gotten that from his childhood that we've just been talking about. Mum and dad not being able to provide for him, dad being a scary kind of character, him being at school and maybe not fitting in with other people simply because he's experiencing all this stuff in the home environment.
Yeah, and you look at the personality formation, that domain of schemas, I guess, is the most powerful domain in terms of, impacting people's, dysfunctional coping modes as well. And he uses a lot of overcompensation there. And I guess think about the guns, accumulation of guns. I mean, part of it, you think, well, maybe that's a feeling powerful, feeling on top of things, like a self-aggrandizer type thing. But, in the what's the unmet emotional need might be, for safety, security, like that makes him feel safe and secure, that he's got that level of ultimate power over everybody, right? You have a gun, you're sort of very much in charge.
So you're saying like, so what would that mode, are you thinking that mode would be? That would be a suspicious, paranoid, over controller type of mode. I got to be,
Yeah, and that fits with the COVID formulation, right? Because at the time when COVID started, I mean, it's all over now and we all, can dissect COVID left, right and centre. But in April 2020, there's a lot of fear and angst in the world and massive uncertainty. Nobody knew what this thing was, what was going to happen, were we going to, how many people were going to die from it, like what the world was going to look like. So if you think about somebody who has a vulnerability to harm, mistrust and abuse, government's putting all these impositions on people, that's extremely triggering.
You lose control, right? Like, so he lost control of his business, lost control of being able to earn an income. He couldn't, go places.
And then this kind of argument or conflict with his partner, then he loses control there. So there's losing control all over the place, which is obviously an intolerable, and also maybe a sense of being oppressed by people in a way. Because I think if you think about having an abusive sort of childhood, there's that people often, when that's triggered, find that intolerable. That feeling of being harshly treated or unfairly treated, or there's no care and sensitivity there. But they can't process it or deal with it, so they kind of flip into these overcompensating modes as a way of just squashing it down, trying to not have it. I'm the man. I'll put my uniform on. I've got my guns, my car full of guns. It's an antidote to feeling like everything's falling apart and I can't control anything.
He certainly, there was a notable change in his baseline behaviour in the months leading up. So his general well-being declined. He became paranoid. He made lots of remarks about distrusting the government. He withdrew hundreds of thousands of dollars from the bank and buried it in his backyard.
Wow.
There was comments by his partner that he was digging holes in the backyard in preparation that he might need to put bodies in there if people were going to trespass. So there was an aspect there where he was believing that there may be some sort of last stand or just anarchy that was going to break out and he would need to defend himself. He was cleaning his firearm. So there's some thought as well that he was going to carry out some sort of violent attack at some stage. Maybe this just occurred quicker than it was intended to because of that brief sort of rage and trigger that happened with his partner at the time.
And the paranoia by the sounds of it, and so I guess if maybe in your mind you're that hostile world, dangerous world kind of schema, mistrust and abuse, and you feel completely disconnected from anyone, like you don't, there's no investment in any kind of relationship where you feel, well, this person matters, like this person can care for me in some way. You kind of don't have anything to stop you, do you? There's nothing to there's no restraint there. So I guess in that kind of uncertain, paranoid way, you kind of, I mean, you are sort of, it's a blaze of glory, isn't it, in his mind, perhaps? You see, he's sort of, because at some point you have to think that the switch flicks where he has that end of line thinking, as in, I'm just going to go and do this, and doesn't stop until he is stopped.
I wonder, though, whether, I mean, it's a blaze of glory, but it seems also very planned through, and it seems very kind of sort of, it seems almost methodical in terms of how it's described, where he's going from one place and then he's got this, like he's got a strategy, he's got a plan. It doesn't feel random in the way that
it's not chaotic, I don't think, in a sense of just chaos. There's reasoning going on, so he's reasoning through it.
Methodology behind it, yeah.
There's a calm amongst the chaos, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right. There's reasoning happening there. So, and you have to think he would have to know that, this was the end of the line for him, the end of his life. You're not going to survive that. And there's a preparedness to have that happen.
Absolutely. I wonder, though, also that if we think about using the bathtub analogy again, that maybe one of his big modes, and I'd be interested to see what you think about this, Nathan, just, with your experience with this issue, these kinds of cases, is some kind of vengeful ruminator mode. You mentioned before that some of the making sense of why he attacked elderly people and why he would seek them out or engage them to then kill them is that there's this kind of anger towards them or resentment towards them because of his family, of his parents, that they seem to be going well or they're still together. So I wonder whether, maybe a big part of him, a big part of a mode for him, maybe before this all happened for maybe a long period of time, was some kind of, ruminator, vengeful, angry ruminator on these kinds of issues.
An injustice collector.
He
collected and harbored and ruminated on things even as trivial as they were, where he felt as though he'd been wronged or hard done by. Right. And very envious and resentful towards anyone that he perceived, maybe getting ahead of him or, trumping him, for instance. So I think
this mode was really significant for him.
Absolutely, yeah. And, when we think about just coming back to those psychological needs, that we would argue that, the violence, a lot of lone actor violence, is about restoring the psychological needs that have been thwarted. And for him, I think it was as much about, retribution towards others as much as it was about nearly an utter contempt towards life. So, he was able to regain that sort of sense of significance and control over others and over, and for himself in carrying out the attack. But it was also very much, I guess, sort of an anti-life, an utter contempt towards life as well.
Yeah, fascinating. I wonder, Lars, if you think about this as a mediating mode, like if we go back to the schema modes, how much the compliant surrenderer mode plays into this. So the compliant surrenderer is surrendering to the schemas. Like, people are shit. People are untrustworthy. Life is awful. The world is a hostile, dangerous place. It's actually, there's no good here for me. There's no, the world's all gone to pot. So that kind of thinking is that compliant surrenderer, which people can,
like just giving up to the schema.
Giving into
can't be trusted.
This is how the world is. This is how people are. That world is, is everything is just shitty, and everyone is shitty.
You have to fight for what you get. You have to take
annihilation. Everyone deserves annihilation, right? So that complying to that compliant surrender, I think at some point has to be relevant before he, and a mediating mode in order to kind of, flip into the overcompensating modes, which are really the offending mode, right? When you're acting on that, you're sort of like, that it kind of, I don't know, I would think if he was a client of mine and you're trying to formulate it, that would be very relevant at some point. It would represent imminence, being in that mode, sitting in that mode.
Maybe, yeah.
There's very much the predator-prey aspect with Wortman. You know, you're either a predator or you're prey. It's very much a black and white view of life. And for him, it was about needing to be dominant, needing to be in control, and needing to be ultimately the one that had the influence over others, because what that represented, if he didn't have that, was that he was highly vulnerable. And I think that was something that he couldn't sit with or accept, so therefore he became the interpersonally dominant individual.
He needed to be on top the whole time. Yeah.
Do you know if he'd ever had any interactions with mental health services or any kind of health intervention in his 51 years, like as a kid or young person? Or
I don't know enough about him as a child, whether that had occurred, but from the medical records that were gained through the commission, he had a lot of issues with alcohol. So alcohol abuse and dependence was a big factor for him. Long pattern of excessive drinking, which he'd struggled with at times. He appears to sort of have periods where he's been able to control that and periods where it's been problematic. But other than that, and I think a narcissistic personality diagnosis, which was floated around by one of the doctors or psychologists that assessed him, he'd never had any extensive involvement with mental health services or psychiatrists or psychologists.
Okay. So it was really just like drug and alcohol or alcohol service?
Yeah, I think that was through a general practitioner that he had some contact around his alcohol use, but alcohol and personality, essentially.
Yeah, okay.
I wonder just also the relevance of fantasy for him in terms of coping modes for it. I know that I'm thinking about how methodical his offending looks like, how prepared he perhaps was. We perhaps can see that there's a vengeful ruminator and injustice collector mode for him. I know that with a lot of the guys that I've worked with over the years who have histories of violence and have histories like these kind of childhood histories that are similar to Wortman's, also will report having what would be described as quite sadistic, over-controlling fantasies of violence, of them hurting or dominating or being in control. And I wonder whether with this guy, it certainly seems like he would have had some kind of fantasy mode that would have replayed or played through these kinds of fantasies of hurting and dominating, of exacting revenge on people in this way, which would have, once the dike was broken, so to speak, it all kind of clicked into place, because not because he hadn't thought about it, but because he'd been thinking about it perhaps for 20, 30 years maybe. And this was just the accumulation of that. What are your thoughts?
That's a good point. Yeah.
I think definitely both violent and sexual fantasies and quite extensive. So we know that he was engaging in all sorts of promiscuous sexual activities to varying degrees, particularly vulnerable people. There's some indication that he was drugging people as well. And there's some reports around some deviant sort of sexual fantasies and role playing that have been documented.
What kind of fantasies?
Or would have to go back, but at times him sort of adopting submissive aspects within context of sex. I'm not sure whether there were some aspects relating to mother sort of fantasies, and I'm not sure if I'm wrong here, so don't hold me account to it, but I had some recollection around maybe diaper fantasies, but I'd need to check whether I was correct around that.
It has a history of paraphilias perhaps as well.
That'd probably be a more accurate way, would be to term it as some paraphilic interests.
Right, okay.
And again, it's this interpersonal way of acting out and trying to deal with these issues, isn't it? Because there's lots of other ways that you can, you can perhaps try to deal with trauma or schema activation that's avoidant, that's really about trying to get away from it. But that's, again, that type of paraphilic behavior is about moving towards people, right? And that dominating or contriving an interpersonal interaction that's really dysfunctional to try to get those needs met, right? That, if it is a mother kind of, fixation in his sexual stuff. I mean, trying to get that nurturance, in a very, unhelpful way.
That's very psychoanalytic formulation, Shay, isn't it?
But when you think about unmet needs, how would you understand that? I mean, it's it kind of fits that space, doesn't it? Yeah.
That's where in the paper that we have written, it's ultimately he's devoid of love, isn't he? He's not an individual that's able to find belonging either, and he's developed these other attributes as overcompensation, even though he may want that connection, he's not capable of establishing that, and that's caused all sorts of ruptures where ultimately sort of it's been about him trying to maintain dominance, despite maybe at times trying to move towards having that connection. He's just simply not capable of it.
Yeah, that emotional intimacy, like his ability to be vulnerable in an emotionally intimate way, which obviously is the cornerstone of healthy relationships, is not something he can do. So that, acting out sexually is a behavioral way of trying to get closeness or, but all that kind of stuff. But it's ultimately, it ultimately doesn't meet the need.
Fascinating case, guys. I'm thinking that we maybe need to sort of wind up and pull this case together. So Shay, did you want to kind of have let's see if we can kind of how do we make sense of this case from a schema perspective? If you're looking at this case and you'd be thinking, well, how do we make sense of it from this perspective as a schema therapist?
I think as the formulation for the PD formulation, I suppose you look at what does a mode map look like for someone who's got those characteristics. I mean, like I said, I think for me, sort of what stands out is definitely that mistrust and abuse, emotional deprivation, abandonment, kind of issues, which are the core sort of, dysfunction. And that, the alcohol abuse is the detached self-soothing. It's the sense of trying to soothe some of that distress and that difficulty and emotional pain he experiences from feeling, not loved and not connected and not like he's belonging in a healthy way. So alcohol abuse kind of dampens that, but it doesn't work, and creates extra problems. So,
and then there's sexual stuff as well. It seems like there's
sexual stuff is sexual self-soothing. I mean, that's a self-soothing mode. So they're sort of avoidant coping modes, and then at some point, like I mentioned before, I think the compliant surrenderer mode is probably really relevant as well, where he just sits in that this is how life is. This is how the world is, and at some point there's a point of no return then when, the offending sort of happens in those overcompensating modes that self-aggrandizer, the predator mode and the conning manipulator, all of that. Once he's made that decision, I think it seems like to just go forth. There's no stopping him. And it's a combination of those modes which just carry it out, which is, and that finality, that end of line thinking, which I don't know, what mode do you think that is? End of line thinking, like a preparedness to die for your cause. Is that self-aggrandizer? I don't know.
I think that it's just my sense of it would be that this is just the accumulation of decades worth of fantasizing about, punishing the world for all the bad things that it's done to you, maybe, and this is kind of, it's just been replayed through so many times in his mind, perhaps, that this maybe just becomes like the button gets pushed and away he goes in these modes: the predator mode, the detached protector mode, the self-aggrandizer, enjoying the power the control. There'll be an element of that, I would imagine, in being dominating
totally.
or seeking
Reveling in
pain that making people, holding people accountable, perhaps, in his mind.
And the underlying thinking, like I'm going to, ultimately die doing this, is again maybe a compliant surrender, a part of that, as in you're just prepared because that's how life is, right? You just surrender to it. This is how I go out.
The nihilism of it.
Because it's almost, his end is almost banal, isn't it? You're at a gas station and you get shot by the cops. Like, that's a banal kind of ending to such a crime spree. Really, it's not like a high stakes shootout at a, whatever, where you kind of think that might end. It's, he's getting petrol presumably, or food or something, like a routine activity, as in criminology they'd call that, and he ends up getting, that's it, the end. Full stop. I don't know that. Yeah, I think he's a fascinating case, but complex. I think he fits every kind of mode of functioning, just about.
Yeah.
But ultimately, somebody who's got an extremely fragile personality, and at the core of it didn't get, very many of their core emotional, human needs met.
Yeah.
I think it's a really hard case to reconcile. And I always go back to, the amount of harm that he has caused is just astronomical. People, families, victims, those in the area will never recover from that, and it's just an enormous tragedy. The other side is that when we talk about it, he was ultimately a child at some point that didn't get the love that he required, and where that grew to was a really troubled, problematic character as he reached adulthood. And I think a conversation like this is really crucial to understand that. But at the same time, there's that difficulty with reconciling that, because while we can understand it and look at it from a psychological perspective, it's always a difficult conversation because we don't want to discount the trauma and the grief and the harm that he's caused.
Absolutely. And I mean, the reality also is, as an adult, irrespective of your upbringing or the difficulties you might have had, you always have a choice, right? You always have a choice. And his choices were, reprehensible, to say the least.
This is maybe a good place to finish. Thank you very much, Nathan, for coming on for a second time on our podcast. I know that you've sort of recently started up a podcast of your own. Maybe you want to tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, what's it called, Nathan?
It's called the Targeted Violence Podcast. So it's very much around this topic, looking at that very targeted, preparation-based violence, the lone act types of attacks, stalking, domestic violence, those that make threats to kill. So it's very case-oriented. So we're getting people that have either sort of law enforcement experience on cases or have had first-hand experience maybe assessing and interviewing offenders. So trying to take a bit of a different lens and focus on a unique aspect of offending.
Oh, Nathan, I feel like I've been in that space with certain people I've worked with.
Very cool. And you have, I believe that there's an episode on now interviewing a detective.
Yes, interviewing former detective Rob Thomas from the Toronto Police Service, who interviewed the Toronto van attacker back in, I think it was 2018. And a very interesting case because it introduced the world and particularly police to the incel ideology, and was one of the first major cases of violence being influenced by some of those ideological beliefs.
Oh, wow.
Okay, well, there you go, listeners. You got to tune on in to Nathan's podcast. What's it on, Nathan? Is it on all the usual channels? Spotify, Apple,
all the usual channels, yes.
Okay, very cool.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you very much for coming on, and thank you very much for listening. We're going to be, we'll be back in the coming months with more podcasts looking at different issues and and a couple of special editions coming up where we focus in on some slightly different kind of concepts, but still relevant to forensic schema therapy. But we're looking at stoicism and also compassion-focused therapy and its application to forensic cases and clients. So tune in for those. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you around.
Thank you.
Get hands-on experience with schema therapy at the Forensic Schema Sessions live training. Visit psychclinic.com.au/workshops for more information.